The square was loud, though her ears heard nothing clearly. Men's voices rose like the lowing of cattle bartering, haggling, laughing too freely under the glare of a hard autumn sun. Dust clung to Eliza's lips, turning breath into chalk. She stood barefoot on the rough boards of the auction platform, eyes fixed on the horizon rather than the crowd. To look at them was to admit she was less than they. To look away was the only scrap of dignity left. Her dress was plain, the color of wheat gone pale in drought. Once she had sewn it with hope, believing it might wrap around a body destined to bear children. Now the same dress betrayed her barrenness, whispered about in kitchens, spat like a curse in barns until she was delivered here, a woman set on a block like grain or mule. The crier's hand struck wood. One sack of corn, a voice muttered, half amused. Two, no, the crowd would not lift their offers higher. They knew her story. They knew her shame. To them she was empty soil. And so it ended quickly. A man she did not know, tall shoulders carrying the weariness of storms, laid down his bid, one sack of corn, yellow kernels gathered from a meager harvest. There was no celebration, no cheer, only a nod. A tightening of rope and the crowd dispersing to their daily errands, leaving her with the scent of livestock and sweat and the faintest echo of humiliation. Eliza did not weep. Tears had abandoned her long ago in nights when she had prayed for a child and woken only to silence. Instead, she listened inwardly to her mother's voice from years past, humming a lullaby by the hearth. The melody lingered like a stubborn ember, refusing to even when the world called her barren, useless, unfit. The man who bought her did not touch her arm as they walked away. He did not meet her eyes. His boots struck dust with measured steps, and she followed her shadow stitched to his. He carried in his gait a silence different from hers, not of shame but of grief turned hard, unyielding. They reached a wagon. A child sat within, knees drawn. Close hair, uncombed, eyes wild as an untamed foal. He did not greet her, did not speak, only stared with a ferocity that made her pulse quicken. In his gaze was a wound she could not yet name. The man gave no words as he lifted the reins. The wagon creaked forward, leaving behind the auction block, the shouting men, the shame that had marked her sale. Ahead stretched the prairie, wide and indifferent grass bending beneath a restless wind. Eliza placed her hands in her lap, folding them as one folds cloth to keep from tearing. She told herself that in this new silence, different, harsher, lonelier than the last, she would not crumble. Perhaps her worth was gone in the eyes of men. But within her chest, the ember of her mother's lullaby still glowed faint but steady. A promise that not all things traded on the block could be broken. And so the wagon rolled on, carrying her into an unknown winter, into a cabin she had never seen, into a life she did not choose. The sack of corn had sealed her fate, yet somewhere between the creak of wheels and the cry of meadowlarks, Eliza whispered to herself, I will not vanish. The boy's eyes did not leave her. The man's silence did not soften. The land opened before them, vast and merciless. In Eliza sat a woman sold, but not yet erased her soul, holding quietly to a song, as if lighting a lantern in the dark. The wagon creaked into the valley as the day bent toward dusk. The prairie stretched outward in all directions, its grasses fading into the blue hush of distance, and overhead the sky pressed low, with a weight of coming winter. For Eliza, every turn of the wheel carried her further from what she had known deeper, into the silence of a land that tolerated neither weakness nor longing. The man she still did not know his name drove with the stillness of a stone. His hands, browned and scarred by seasons of rope and plow, did not tremble. He had the bearing of someone who spoke rarely and expected less in return. Beside him she was a shadow tethered by necessity, her future folded into the rhythm of hoofbeats on dry earth. At last the cabin came into sight. It stood alone on a rise above the field's walls, darkened by age roof sagging beneath the strain of storms. A thin line of smoke curled from its chimney gray as worn cloth. To Eliza's eyes, it was less a home than a shelter shaped by need rather than care. Its edges bore the imprint of a man surviving, not living. The wagon slowed, wheels crunching over frost-bitten soil. The child scrambled down before the horses halted, darting past Eliza with a quickness that startled her. He moved like a creature half wild, at ease only in open spaces. His hair tangled in the wind, his shirt patched clumsily at the shoulders. He did not speak, only vanished around the corner of the house, like a fox retreating to its den. She climbed down with careful steps, bare soles numb against the cold ground. The man hauled the sack of corn from the wagon, setting it inside the door before speaking a word. "You'll sleep near the hearth," he said at last, voice low, roughened by disuse. "Work if you can, eat what's given, that's all." It was not cruelty in his tone, but neither was there welcome. His words fell like stones into a well-unadorned final. Eliza inclined her head, unable to muster reply. Inside the cabin smelled of wood smoke and tallow, a scent both heavy and strangely comforting. Shadows clung to the corners. A table stood against the wall, rough-hewn, scarred by knives. One chair was broken, the other bore the weight of solitude. Along the far side of the room, a narrow cot lay empty, the blanket folded stiff from disuse. Perhaps it had once belonged to a wife now absent. Perhaps it had always been alone. The fire in the hearth was little more than embers. Eliza knelt before it, feeding it with kindling, until a flame stirred. The glow touched her face, warming her skin, and for the first time since the auction block, her breath loosened. She thought of the boy, the feral look in his eyes, the way his small hands had clenched around nothing. Something in that gaze mirrored her own past, her own losses, though his were still raw while hers had been buried beneath years of silence. She did not know what her role would be here. Purchased like seed for sowing, yet she carried no promise of fruit. Still, as the fire caught and filled the room with flickering light, she felt the faint stirrings of a resolve. She would not allow herself to be only what they had named her. She would wait. She would watch. And if the Blanc allowed her presence, perhaps she might offer him something the world had long since stolen from her, the simple act of gentleness. The man moved about the room without ceremony, setting bread upon the table, filling a tin cup with water. His silence pressed against her like another wall. He glanced once at the fire, then at her hands near the flame, but said nothing. His grief lay quiet and deep like ice beneath the soil, unseen but unyielding. Night descended. The prairie winds rattled the shutters. Somewhere outside, the boy's footsteps scuffed in the dirt circling the cabin before he slipped inside and curled near the fire, no word spoken. His small body trembled, not from cold, but from a grief that clung like a second skin. Eliza watched him, her hands folded in her lap. She longed to speak, to hum, to offer something beyond silence. But words might frighten him further. So she too remained silent, letting only the fire speak for them all, crackling, breathing warmth into a room starved of tenderness. And in that quiet, she sensed a truth: her life had been reduced to a transaction. But here in this lonely cabin, something unspoken awaited. Not passion, not promise, but the fragile possibility of becoming more than what she had been sold for. The ember within her mother's lullaby glowed again, faint and stubborn. She wondered if one night she might dare to hum it aloud. The evening meal was a ritual of silence. The cabin walls breathed with the crackle of firewood, but no words passed between them. The table, scarred with years of use, held its meager offering: bread, rough as stone beans, simmered thin, and a pitcher of water drawn cold from the well. Eliza sat with hands folded, waiting for some signal, but none came. The man took his seat first, shoulders bent with the weight of long winters and harder days. The boy slipped onto the bench at his side, eyes lowered, hair falling over his brow like a veil. They ate without prayer, without pause, as though nourishment were merely fuel, not grace. Her stomach knotted with hunger, yet more with hesitation. At her former home, meals had been filled with murmurs, the scratch of spoons, the rustle of laughter, the faint invocation to heaven. Here each bite sounded louder than it should, echoing in the silence like trespass. The boy chewed without looking at her, but Eliza saw how his fingers clenched the bread, how he tore at it, not with ease, but with guarded defiance. His shoulders hunched like a small animal, protecting its fragile core. She longed to ease the tension coiled in him, but what bridge could she build across this silence? It was a small act, almost nothing. When the loaf reached her, she tore a piece, not for herself, but quietly laid it on the boy's plate. Her hands did not linger. She moved with the gentleness of placing seed into soil, uncertain whether it would take root. The boy's eyes flicked to the offering, then to her face. He did not smile. He did not thank, but he did not push it away. The father did not notice. Or perhaps he did, but chose to ignore it. His gaze remained fixed on his meal, each motion deliberate, as though to eat was to resist grief itself. The fire's light caught the planes of his face, revealing a man weathered not by years alone, but by loss. Eliza sensed it in the stillness of his jaw, in the way his breath seemed to come heavier at the mention of nothing at all. She nibbled her bread, slowly tasting dust more than grain. Yet beneath the heaviness of silence, a thread of resolve began to weave within her. Perhaps she could not fill the room with speech words, here were brittle things. But she could offer presence. She could offer patience. After the meal, the boy slipped from the table without sound, vanishing into the darker corner near the hearth. The man stood, collected the pitcher, and stepped outside the door, creaking in his wake. Eliza gathered the bowls, rinsed them in water, chilled to the bone. Her fingers ached, but she welcomed the pain. It was something tangible in a world that had turned her body into transaction and her name into rumor. When the chores were done, she sat by the hearth. The boy hovered nearby, not close but not as distant as before. His eyes, shadowed by grief, still carried the wildness of someone untethered. She did not force closeness. She only folded her hands and let the warmth of the fire spread. From the rafters above, the wind pressed its low moan against the cabin, carrying with it the scent of earth gone dormant. Eliza listened, and in the quiet she remembered her mother, again remembered how silence could be broken, not with many words, but with one small kindness repeated until it grew familiar. Tonight it had been a piece of bread. Tomorrow perhaps another gesture, small as a flame in the long dark. She lay upon the cot that night, facing the glow of dying embers. Sleep would not come quickly. Her mind wandered to the boy's downcast eyes, to the man's silence thick as stone. She wondered whether they dreamed of the woman who had once kept this hearth, whose absence was still stitched into every seam of the cabin. The boy stirred in his sleep, across the room a muffled whimper, rising like a prayer left unfinished. Eliza pressed her hands against her chest, whispering words she did not voice aloud. Let me be something more than what I was sold for. Let me be a hand that steadies, not a shadow that burdens. The prairie wind hushed against the window, and the house settled deeper into night. And so began their supper silences, heavy, wordless, yet not without seeds of change, hidden like roots beneath frozen ground. The days shortened, as though the sky itself was weary. Light faded early, and the land seemed to draw into itself, folding grass and soil beneath frost. The winds traveled without rest, scraping the prairie bare, carrying with them the smell of snow before it ever touched the earth. Eliza rose each morning to the dim glow of coals barely alive in the hearth. Her first task was to coax them back into flame, feeding splinters of kindling until warmth returned to the cabin. It was the only time she felt a measure of control that something fragile could endure because of her patient tending. The man labored outdoors even as the cold deepened. His figure moved against the whitened horizon's shoulders, bent steps slow but relentless. He rarely spoke when he returned, shaking frost from his coat, bringing the smell of iron air with him. His silence pressed heavier, now thick as the snow clouds gathering above. The boy lingered close to the fire. He would sit with knees drawn up, gaze unfocused, as though waiting for something that never came. His lips rarely moved yet. Sometimes Eliza thought she heard whispers, fragments of sound, lost before they became words. She wondered what prayers might linger still within him, or whether grief had stilled his tongue. Her own past pressed against her in the nights when the cabin groaned with wind and shadows. The memory of being called barren gnawed at her like hunger. Empty soil, they had named her. Even here in this cabin, not her own, she feared that truth clung to her skin, invisible yet undeniable. She longed to cast it off, to prove by some unseen measure that her worth had not withered. But what could she offer in a house already hollowed by death? One night when the storm thickened and the shutters rattled like drums, Eliza woke to a sound more fragile than the wind. A child's murmur. She lifted her head and listened. The boy curled on his pallet near the fire was speaking in sleep. The words were soft, broken by breath, but clear enough to pierce her stillness. Mama, don't go! Her chest tightened as if bound by rope. The sound was not mere dreaming. It was longing, given voice, the grief of a child who carried more sorrow than his small frame could bear. Eliza sat upright, hands trembling in her lap. She did not dare wake him, but she watched, heart aching, as his fingers twitched toward the empty air, reaching for someone who would never return. When morning came, the boy was silent again, face shuttered, eyes downcast. Yet Eliza carried his midnight whisper within her, a secret confession not meant for ears, but entrusted to hers nonetheless. It became a weight and a calling to hold what he could not speak by day, to guard the flicker of his broken prayers until he might kindle them again. She found herself humming while she worked a tune low and wordless, drawn from the memory of her mother's songs. At first, it was for her own comfort, to fill the emptiness between her and the wind. But one afternoon, as she hummed near the fire, she noticed the boy's eyes lift, his breathing stilled. He did not move closer, but he listened. And that was enough. The man entered, then boots heavy with snow. He paused only a moment, gaze flicking toward them both before setting down his load of wood. His face gave nothing away, but Eliza thought she saw in his eyes a shadow stirred a flicker of memory, perhaps of nights when his wife's voice had once woven warmth through these same walls. The storm outside, it wailed on yet within the cabin, something small had shifted. A thread had been tied, fragile, tentative, invisible but present between the boy's silence and her own. Eliza sat near the fire, her hands folded, and thought, perhaps the world is not asking me to bear children. Perhaps it is asking me to bear tenderness. The storm had passed, but its echoes still clung to the earth. Snow lay heavy upon the roof, and the shutters bore the mark of wind like scars upon a face. Inside the cabin, the fire glowed steady, its light spilling over the wooden floor, as if stitching the room together with warmth. Eliza sat near the hearth, mending a sleeve with careful hands. The boy lingered not far, crouched low, his small fingers tracing patterns in the ash-dusted stones. He had not spoken, not truly, but he no longer avoided her presence. His eyes flicked toward her when he thought she would not notice, curious, measuring, wary as a fawn before the hunter. She hummed softly, letting the tune drift into the room like smoke. No words, only a string of notes remembered from nights long ago when her mother's lullabies wrapped her in safety. The boy shifted the firelight, painting gold across his cheek, and after a moment he edged closer. Not enough to touch, but enough that the warmth from the flames brushed both of them alike. Eliza's needle stilled. She let the song linger low and steady, her gaze turned toward the fire so as not to startle him. For the first time since she had entered this house, she felt a thread being spun, fine, fragile, but real. A bridge not of words, but of nearness. Behind them the door creaked. The man entered, boots scattering snow across the threshold. He paused as he saw them. The boy seated close to her, her voice woven with the fire's crackle. Something in his stance faltered. He was not a man given to softness, and yet the sight struck him with an ache he had long trained himself to ignore. He set the axe against the wall, brushed snow from his coat, and stood in silence. Eliza sensed his presence but did not look up. She continued her hum, though her heart quickened. The boy, sensing his father, drew a little back, shoulders tightening, yet he did not retreat completely. He stayed within the ring of firelight, within reach of the warmth she had offered. The man's eyes rested on them both. The hymn tugged at something buried, something he had buried deep when his wife's laughter had ceased to fill this house. He noticed, too, the chipped cup upon the table, once hers, now unused, set aside, as though even the act of drinking from it were a wound too raw. The song and the cup together brought him near to breaking. He turned away sharply, but not before Eliza saw it, the flicker of conflict, the crack in his silence. It was not anger that lived in his eyes, but sorrow hardened into armor. She knew the look, for she wore it once herself in different form. When each month without a child had carved deeper into her soul, the boy leaned closer to the fire, once more lulled by the hum that seemed to promise something unspoken. His small body eased, his head tilted slightly, eyes half closed in the light's glow. Eliza let the melody fade, replaced by the quiet sigh of flames. She did not reach for him, did not intrude. She only allowed the silence to rest more gently than before. Later, as she banked the fire for the night, she noticed the boy's small figure curled on the rug near her chair, not upon his own pallet. The man had gone to his room, leaving them to the hush. Eliza spread an extra cloth over the boy, tucking it at his shoulder with a hand as light as breath. He stirred but did not wake. She lingered then, watching the glow fade to embers. The cabin, once cold with silence, now seemed to breathe differently. The change was not large, a boy shifting nearer, a father's gaze unsettled, a song left hanging in the air. But to Eliza it was everything. It was proof that even barren soil could yield life if tended with patience, if given warmth, if believed in. The fire crackled softly, casting shadows across the walls. She thought of the man's scarred hands, the boy's hollow eyes, the chipped cup, the lullabies that still lived within her. All were fragments, but together they might form something whole. And so she whispered into the quiet, not for them to hear, but for her own soul, let this house learn to breathe again. Let the fire keep burning, not only for warmth, but for love unspoken. The embers glowed like a promise. The snow had not lifted for days. It lay in drifts against the cabin walls, muffling sound, turning the prairie into a white expanse where no path could be seen, only imagined. Life shrank to the boundaries of wood and fire table and hearth. Within those walls, Eliza began to weave her days not as prisoner but as caretaker of small, unseen things. The boy followed her with eyes more than with steps. He did not yet trust her hands, but he lingered near when she chopped vegetables or poured water into the tin basin. Sometimes when she reached for kindling, he placed a stick in her palm, without a word, his face unreadable. Each gesture was small as a seed, yet she gathered them as though each were a sprout of spring beneath snow. One afternoon when the wind howled fiercest, Eliza sat by the hearth, with the boy close enough that the warmth touched them both. His fingers twisted at the hem of his shirt, restless. She watched him a long while, then placed her own hands together, palms folded, fingers steepled. The movement was gentle, deliberate, not commanding. The boy's eyes narrowed, cautious. "This," she whispered, her voice scarcely above the fire's breath, "is how one speaks to heaven." He stared, lips pressed tight. She did not explain further, did not insist. Instead, she closed her eyes and let silence fill the space, her folded hands resting like a cradle in her lap. After a long pause, she spoke, not loudly, not with flourish, but with words soft as cloth, gratitude. For warmth, for bread, for breath. Not for herself alone, but for him as well. The boy shifted, uncertain. His hands twitched, then tightened into fists. Yet his gaze did not leave hers. She waited, patient, as soil waits for thaw. At last, with the awkwardness of one learning to walk, he mirrored her gesture, palm pressed together in clumsy mimicry. His eyes closed for a heartbeat, his breath caught in his throat. No words came, but Eliza did not need them. The act itself was prayer enough. Something within her ached and mended at once. She had been called barren, unfit for motherhood, yet here was a child shaping his hands to hers, letting her show him the path to a God he thought had abandoned him. In his silence, she found her own worth returned not through birth, but through nurture. From the far side of the room, a board creaked. Eliza turned, startled, to see the man standing in the doorway, snow dusting his shoulders. He had returned earlier than she expected. His eyes fixed upon the boy, then upon her, unreadable, as always, but deeper now, shadowed by something unsettled. The boy, sensing his father, pulled his hands apart quickly, eyes darting downward. Shame flickered across his small face, as though he had done wrong by reaching toward heaven in the sight of a man who had stopped believing. The father's jaw tightened. He set down his gloves, his gaze heavy with both longing and resistance. For a breath it seemed he might speak, but no words came. Instead, he turned sharply and busied himself with the woodpile. The air in the room shifted colder despite the fire. Eliza felt the sting of his silence, yet she did not scold the boy, nor retreat from what had begun. She touched his shoulder lightly, guiding him back toward the warmth of the hearth. "It is enough," she murmured. And the boy, though wary, leaned the smallest measure into her hand. That night, as the fire dimmed, she lay awake listening to the winter's endless breath against the shutters. She thought of the boy's hands folded in prayer, of the father's silence, heavier than snow. She thought, too, of her own emptiness, how it had once seemed the sum of her life, and realized that emptiness could be filled not with children of her own, but with children entrusted even briefly to her care. Her eyes closed at last. Before sleep claimed her, she whispered a prayer of her own. Not for escape, not for change, but for patience, that she might keep tending this fragile soil until life grew from it again. The storm finally eased, but the weight of silence inside the cabin did not. Days stretched into a rhythm of tasks, splitting wood, mending clothes, drawing water through the ice of the well. Yet beneath that rhythm, tension coiled like a rope pulled too tight. Eliza felt it in the man's gaze, heavy and unsettled, lingering whenever she guided the boy's hands in prayer or hummed a hymn near the fire. One evening, as twilight dimmed to indigo, she sat by the hearth with the boy at her side. His palms folded clumsily within her own, his lips whispering broken syllables. He was not asking for toys nor for bread, but for his father. The words were halting yet tender. Keep him safe, keep him kind. The man entered then, boots striking hard against the floor. His face worn as the land itself carried something brittle. He froze at the sight of them, the boy's head bowed, Eliza's hands enfolding his. For a long moment he stood in the doorway, shadows gathering at his back. Then his voice came low but sharp, as though wrenched from a place he had long sealed shut. "Enough," the boy's startled hands flying apart. Eliza's heart clenched, but she kept her gaze steady. "You'll not fill his head with notions," the man said, his words flat yet trembling beneath. "He needs strength, not whispers to heaven. What has heaven ever done for him?" The boy's eyes widened, a flicker of fear breaking across his small face. Eliza saw more than anger in the father. She saw grief raw and jagged, disguised as pride. This was not rejection of her, nor even of prayer itself, but of the memory of unanswered pleas. The loss of his wife had carved him hollow, and prayer to him was salt rubbed into that wound. She rose, slowly, careful not to startle either man or child. "I do not seek to weaken him," she said softly. Her voice carried no defiance, only quiet steadiness. "Prayer is not escape. It is courage whispered in the dark. It is hope when the world offers none." The man's jaw clenched, his fists curled at his sides. He looked at her as though she had spoken a foreign tongue. "You know nothing of hope," he said. His tone was harsher now, but his eyes betrayed him, weary pleading the eyes of a man who once begged heaven and heard only silence in return. Eliza's breath trembled, yet she did not retreat. "You are wrong," she whispered. "I know the ache of asking and being refused. I know the shame of being named barren. Yet still I bow my head, because if I stop, then grief is all that remains." The boy pressed closer to her side, his small hand clutching at her sleeve. His father's eyes dropped to that hand, a child's trust given not to him, but to the woman he had bought for grain. Something in his face cracked then, if only for an instant. Not softened, not healed, but fractured enough to let light touch the wound. He turned abruptly, retreating to the far side of the cabin. The sound of wood shifting covered the silence of his breath. He did not speak again that night. Eliza guided the boy back to the hearth, settling him with quiet words. When his eyes finally closed in sleep, she lingered awake, staring into the flames. She thought of the father's anger, sharp as the wind outside, and of the sorrow beneath it. She knew now that her presence was not merely tolerated, it was stirring what he had buried. The fire burned low, its light flickering across her face. She whispered into the hush, not for the man to hear, but for the child between them both. "Love does not demand. It waits. It endures. And even the hardest soil can yield if rain should come." Dawn came pale, the horizon veiled in mist. The prairie lay hushed, as though the world itself were holding its breath. Inside the cabin, the boy stirred before the fire had been coaxed back to life. His small body trembled, not from cold, but from something deeper. Eliza, rising from her cot, found him already awake, hands folded tightly as if guarding a secret. She knelt beside him, her own hands brushing warmth back into the hearth. The boy glanced at her, hesitant, then closed his eyes. His lips moved soft as falling snow. She leaned closer to hear, and the words, broken yet clear, settled in her chest. "God help my father." The simplicity of it pierced her. A child who had lost his mother, and nearly his voice, now prayed not for himself, but for the man who had given him bread, but withheld tenderness. Eliza's throat ached with unshed tears. She let the boy finish, then gathered him quietly against her, her palm resting over his hair. The father entered moments later, brushing snow from his shoulders. His eyes fell upon them, the boy folded in prayer. Eliza's hand upon him, and for once he did not turn away. His breath caught in his throat, though no sound escaped. He stood still, as if rooted the scene before him, pressing against the armor he had worn too long. The boy opened his eyes and, trembling, looked up. "For you, Papa," he whispered. His voice cracked, but it was voice nonetheless, the first words Eliza had heard from him, spoken in daylight. The silence that followed was heavier than any storm. The father's hands, scarred and calloused, clenched at his sides. His face, stern with habit, shifted, not softened, not yet, but unsettled, fractured by something he could no longer deny. He tried to speak, but no words came. His pride so long, his shield faltered beneath the weight of his son's fragile gift. For what strength could surpass a child's prayer, spoken not in bitterness but in love unearned? Eliza did not intrude. She remained still, her hand resting lightly on the boy's back. Her gaze turned toward the fire so as not to press the moment. She understood that recognition must rise like dawn, slowly, almost imperceptibly, until light claimed the room. At last the father exhaled a sound rough and long. He moved to the table, sat heavily, and pressed his palms against the scarred wood. He did not speak, but he bowed his head, not in prayer, not yet, but in surrender to the silence that now carried weight beyond grief. The boy's face brightened faintly, as though he had seen a crack in the fortress that walled his father's heart. Eliza watched quiet, her chest swelling with a fragile hope. This was no sudden transformation, no miracle of tongues or visions. It was smaller, truer, a man lowering his head beneath the burden of love he could not name. The fire glowed stronger, filling the cabin with warmth. Eliza folded the moment into her memory, knowing such tenderness must be carried carefully like a candle against the wind. The recognition was not complete, but it had begun. And beginnings she knew were sacred. That night, when the boy lay asleep, she glanced toward the man across the room. Their eyes met just briefly in the glow of embers. He did not look away. The silence between them was no longer hostile, no longer empty. It was something new, tentative, uncertain yet alive. Eliza lowered her gaze, her heart steady as the fire's pulse. She thought the corn was nothing. This boy's prayer, this man's bowed head, that is the true harvest. And in the quiet recognition of that truth, she felt the dignity once stolen from her begin to return. The days lengthened by minutes, though winter still pressed its cold palm against the land. The snow outside no longer howled with storm, but lay quiet, waiting for thaw. Inside the cabin, a different quiet had begun to take root. Not the brittle silence of grief, but one softened by small gestures, subtle as breath. One evening the fire burned steady, its glow painting the walls in amber. Eliza sat by the hearth spinning thread with a patience that steadied her own heart. The boy rested on the rug, chin propped on his arms, eyes half closed in warmth. Across the room, the father sat at the table, hands idle, gaze wandering not toward the floor, but toward the flame. It was he who shifted first. Rising from his chair, he took the second seat, the one long pushed against the wall, left unused since his wife's absence. He dragged it closer to the fire, the scrape of wood on wood echoing through the room. Then without word, he set it beside Eliza's chair. She froze, threads slipping from her fingers. The gesture was small, yet in its smallness was an ocean. He had made space for her, not at the edge, not at the wall, but within the circle of warmth. The boy's eyes lifted wide with quiet wonder. He looked from his father to Eliza, then back again, as if testing whether what he saw was real. When his father lowered himself into the chair, the boy's face softened. He shifted closer to the fire, to them both, his body settling into peace he had not known for months. The man did not speak. He did not need to. The act itself spoke more loudly than words. Eliza bowed her head slightly, a silent acknowledgement of the dignity returned to her, not as chattel, not as burden, but as presence. In the days that followed, she noticed other changes. A second bowl placed at the table without hesitation. Wood carried inside before she asked. Once, when her hands cracked from cold water, he left a small jar of salve upon the shelf without remark. These were not grand offerings, but they were real pieces of respect offered, quietly restoring what the auction block had sought to strip away. And she in turn gave what she could. Bread set aside for the boy before he asked. The tune of a hymn lifted while sweeping the floor. A hand upon the boy's back when he faltered, steadying him until he found his step again. At night, as the fire dimmed, she sometimes caught the father watching his son sleep. His face, once carved by hardness, seemed softer in those moments, weary still, but softened by something beyond survival. Perhaps gratitude, perhaps shame, perhaps a love he had thought lost forever. Eliza lay upon her cot, listening to the slow breath of the cabin. She thought of the chair by the fire, of the salve on the shelf, of the prayer whispered by the boy. She thought of her own journey from being sold for corn to sitting now in a place of warmth, her dignity not only preserved but slowly restored. The prairie outside was still locked in winter. Yet within the cabin, something had begun to thaw. And Eliza, once barren soil, felt within herself the first stirrings of a different kind of fruitfulness, not of womb but of spirit of tenderness, that rebuilt what grief had broken. The firelight danced over the three of them, no longer strangers, no longer merely bound by necessity, but tied by threads finer than corn or coin, respect, presence, and the slow return of love. The prairie shed its white shroud slowly, as though reluctant to release winter's hold. Snow thinned first in patches, then in streams of meltwater cutting through the fields. Brown earth emerged raw and waiting, its scent rising into the air, damp, bitter, yet filled with promise. The cabin, once closed against the storm, opened its shutters to the pale light of spring. Eliza swept the floor with a steady rhythm, her hands remembering the patterns of labor as her heart learned the patterns of peace. The boy trailed after her, carrying twigs or dropping scraps of cloth, eager to help, though clumsy in the doing. She guided him with gentleness, patient as one tending a sapling bent by winds. The man worked the fields, again shoulder squared beneath the horizon. Yet his steps, once driven by silence, seemed now less burdened. In the evenings when he returned with soil clinging to his boots, his eyes no longer drifted past her as though she were absent. They lingered not long, but enough to say she was seen. At the table, the changes grew clearer. Where once there had been only one chair claimed and another abandoned, now 3 places bore their share of bread. No words marked the meals yet, the silence had shifted. It was no longer brittle but whole, carrying within it the hum of belonging. One evening as dusk bled into violet, Eliza set a loaf upon the table. The boy, small hands folded, looked first to her, then to his father. His voice still fragile but stronger than before. Four rose in a tremor of prayer. Thank you for fire, for food, for Papa, for her. The father's breath caught. He lowered his head, not commanded, not ashamed, but freely, as though bowing to something larger than grief. His palms, scarred and calloused, rested open upon the table. Eliza's chest tightened with quiet wonder. This was not triumph, not miracle, but restoration as gentle and unassuming as spring itself. Afterward, when the boy drifted to sleep by the fire, the father moved the kettle from the hearth and returned it with care. He paused, then set a hand upon the back of her chair. The touch was brief, wordless, yet it carried more weight than any oath. It was recognition not of ownership, but of presence, of dignity restored. The prairie winds still carried their chill, but the house breathed differently now. It held warmth not only from flame, but from 3 lives bound by loss and remade by tenderness. Eliza lay upon her cot that night, listening to the hush of the earth preparing for seed. She thought of the corn once traded for her, how it had seemed to mark the sum of her worth. Yet here in this cabin she had seen a boy fold his hands, a man bow his head, and her own soul lifted back into song. The sack of corn was nothing. The harvest, she realized, had been this, a home rebuilt in stillness, a dignity returned, and a love that did not clamor, but endured steady as fire in the dark. Spring settled upon the prairie with a gentleness that seemed almost hesitant, as though the land itself feared to trust in renewal. The grass rose timidly from the thawed earth, green threads stitching across a fabric once torn by snow. Streams began to murmur again, carrying the sound of movement where silence had reigned for so long. In the cabin, life shifted with the season. Bread rose, warmer fire burned steadier, and voices once absent began to fill the emptiness with halting grace. The boy who had hidden in silence now whispered prayers not only at the hearth, but beneath the open sky. His words carried like seeds upon the wind. His father, who had carried grief like a burden carved into bone, now bowed his head without shame, letting the stillness speak for him when words would not come. And Eliza, once sold, once called barren, once cast aside, found herself no longer measured by what she could not give, but by the presence she offered. Her worth had been weighed on the auction block and found wanting, yet here, in the quiet rebuilding of a home, her dignity had been restored piece by piece. She was no man's possession, no family's cast-off, but a flame that endured, lighting a path where darkness once lay. The prairie would always be harsh. Storms would come, winters would test, grief would never vanish entirely. But there was a new kind of strength here, not the strength of bartering corn or weathering storms, but the strength of tenderness, of hands folded in prayer of silence, shared without fear. For some stories are not about grand triumphs or sudden joy. They are about the slow mending of souls, the restoration of what was forgotten, and the quiet truth that even the most broken lives can find warmth again if given a place by the fire. And so the tale closes not with thunder, but with the soft glow of embers, steady, enduring, eternal.